need to define our terms, because I myself am using in my mind this conversation two different definitions of the terms collectivists. So maybe Aaron and Neil need to both give your individual definitions of collectivism.
Okay. Well, my version of a collectivism is when a group self-identifies with a larger, with an individual self-identifies with a larger group. Like their identity becomes connected to that group, and they make their individual decisions are greatly influenced, and sometimes even limited by that group. I don't think there's any context in human society where that's not the case.
Would you say that family then would be represented within that definition?
Yeah, it's kind of the root of it. If you look at
sure.
human groups, they start off as families and then extend to families, and tribes are kind of just an extension of that. And then a tribe is, in my opinion, is the most stable human configuration. It's a pack of humans, and it's when it gets over a certain size, it becomes impossible to maintain the actual personal relationships that are required for a self-organized system. So the tribes split up and they become multiple tribes. Whereas we have in those kinds of systems, like inside of a family, common ownership is just a given. Like, do I sit there and ration out? Like, do I sell something to my daughter? No, hell no. I don't even think about it. It's like, giving food to my daughter is like giving food to myself. Giving food to my wife is like giving food to myself. I don't think about it. And I take that for granted. People take that for granted. And yet that's a very, it sounds like a left-leaning concept if you extend that to other people in society. Well, is it really that crazy if you extend it to your mother and your grandmother if they were living next door? Not really. I would feed my mother. I wouldn't feel like I was, I wouldn't sell my mom something. The question is how far you extend that feeling. And so, my thought is that I lived in Mexico for a long time, and they had these in the town that I lived in. They would have these giant houses that were built over generations, where multiple generations would live in the same house. And these were really poor people, but they just incrementally added on to the house, and they never kicked each other out. It wasn't like, you get to turn 18 and then they say, well, hit the road, go get a job, go to college, do whatever, like they do in American society where there's this expectation of being a nuclear family, and if you hang around with your family, then you're a loser. And what I found is that even though they made a whole lot less, if you were lucky in Mexico, where I was, you made $10 a day. I made $10 a day because I at one point ran out, but in order to get $10 a day, I had to go to Jalapa, which was an entire hour away by bus. So that was a huge thing. In town, the average wage was $7 a day. So you can imagine, that's really hard to live with. And the price differentiation thing with food and such, it doesn't make it where you're it's just really easy with $7 a day, even with lower prices on certain products. But they actually had a much higher degree of social stability in terms of taking care of people, because there's people out of work for months and months and months. Even getting a $7 a day job is not guaranteed in Mexico. And yet the families would take care of each other. There was no welfare system whatsoever. And you wouldn't see people out in the street in poverty to the degree that you would see in the United States. It was incredible. They actually took care of themselves. They made the state unnecessary. And that's the point that I'm talking about, is that the way that we set things up, the way that we structure society, actually creates the need for the state. And then it creates all the need for enforcement because it's an absurd system that no one would voluntarily go along with.
Let's get Neil's definition here so we can at least get a wider perspective of what collectivism is.
Let me go with, first of all, I wanted to point out, to kind of piggyback off of Aaron's comment that when the British were conquering the Irish and the Scottish, one of the first things that they did was work very hard to destroy the clan system. Irish and Scottish families used to be huge, like, into the triple digits. You would recognize each other by your tartan, meaning the color of your kilts and other clothing. And, if the British were to, say, go to a village and burn down everybody's house, in an effort to, terrorize them, then they could just go to another clan village and those people would immediately take care of them just because they were members of their clan. When you break everybody up into smaller groups and especially individuals, it's really easy to control you because you don't have anywhere to go. You don't have anyone that you can count on. And as the family unit breaks down and the individualistic system gets to be the point that it is now, you generally find that it's much easier for the system to control people now as well. It's like if I were to lose my job, if it weren't for my friends, right now I'd be screwed. And my friends had to step in and help me more than once. It was not my family that helped me. And that's actually a fairly common thing. When it comes to what I think collectivism is, I know that essentially the problem is it's kind of an issue of who's using the word. If you're hanging out with randroids or people from the libertarian movement, they tend to refer to just any group of people working together as collectivism. And that's, they always refer to it in the negative. To me, it could mean either, but overall, I think that a group working together, as long as it's voluntary, is fine. I think that the libertarian should probably concentrate more on the idea of forced collectivism, where you have to be part of something, some group somewhere. That's where it becomes a detriment. That's where it obviously can be a tool of tyranny.
Well, the immediate question that comes to mind then, because I understand the clan system. Over in Iraq, there was the various tribes and nations that allowed them to survive. And one of the observations I made was, if you don't have proper access to the markets, if you don't have proper access to technology or the various avenues that technology in the markets give you, one of the systems that does work is people begin to pull together for their own survival. People begin to pull together usually by a sense of commonality within ethics or within family background, and you get these tribal nations as a survival mechanism. And it works as a almost background super hardened system against outside pressures, whether they be environmental, political, or whatever. They work fantastically. These various clans and tribes that existed over there, even in Afghanistan, have been going through tyranny and war, and they still stick together. But they do so because it is to their obvious self-benefit to do so. And that's one thing I would want to bring back is, to what point does collectivism, regardless of the voluntary nature, not work? Or does it not benefit the individuals to maintain such a thing if proper access to resources? For example, the Venus Project wants to create an enormous amount of abundance. Well, if you have all this abundance, it's not really going to be necessary to stick together in these tribal nations or in these clan-like functions, because there will be so much going around everywhere. And I think that's one of the reasons, although not the prime reason, why families, I think, break down in super industrialized nations, is that there is more options. And I think that with options comes the necessity of the tribe no longer quite as completely essential. It isn't 100% cast in stone. You will not make it without this tribe. But with that also comes the illusion that you can make it completely on your own, whereas instead you're accessing 1 billion people, 6 billion people on the planet, with the markets and technology being where it is. So the question is, does collectivism ever really end? And at what point does the size of the collectivism become influential towards the pressures that's put on the individual to survive?
Well, one thing you said there makes the assumption that such a system could exist in this extended form without the state and not have these tight-knit groups.
I'm not putting forward my personal beliefs. I'm putting forward caveats to what you had.
Well, yeah,
as collectivism.
Actually, this is one of the questions that these points of disagreement I've had with the official Zeitgeist films, and I know that the films don't necessarily represent a hard and fast idea. I mean, this was Peter Joseph putting out some ideas, but to me, the concept of having a global system, or even just a nation like the size of the United States, operating without a state to coordinate all of these interconnections, and without people managing in local structures their sovereignty and such. I mean, I just don't see it possible to have a stateless society and some kind of massive overarching coordination system for a piece of land the size of the United States without somehow coercion coming into it. That's just my thought. It just seems like it would go to that.
If you were looking to maintain a unity, yes, it would require violence. I think that if there's anything that history has taught us, like Abraham Lincoln, who's touted as a hero, and I actually have a very opposite opinion of the man than what the massive public views him. He saw that the South was doing what the United States, the original 13 colonies, was doing. He had no real justification to do what he was doing. Yet he went to war to maintain unity of central authority and so on and so forth. If you wanted to do that, whereas you could have a country the size of anything, and it can succeed down to the last individual, if it should so choose to do so. But one thing that I would like to say, as Wertbark would say, is that the great non sequitur is to assume that a society is a nation, whereas society is society regardless of the government or structure that is put in place. In fact, the structure has to have a successful society before you can have a government.
Yeah, I mean, at this point,
it's got to go that direction. It can't go the other way.
Well, can I respond to the points about the idea of a large collective that could interact without coercion?
Yeah.
Essentially, this is one of the things actually that where the Venus Project deviates from being a normal anarchist school. Most anarchist schools, whether it be anarcho-syndicalism or anarcho-communism or anarcho-capitalism, they all kind of depend on a certain philosophical view being held by everybody within the group, and that essentially is what creates, the non-aggression principle working and things like that. The main fundamental difference, for example, between the way that anarcho-syndicalists or anarcho-communists would approach things and the way the Venus Project would approach things is that the Venus Project acknowledges that people don't just suddenly start behaving certain ways, because you've done a really good job of making that sound romantic or whatever. There has to be a strong understanding of how human behavior functions, how the environment shapes behavior, and how the environment contributes to the kinds of positive behavior patterns that you want in society. And that's actually like a major missing component that most of these other systems don't ever utilize, is that if you basically ignore the environment and then just expect everybody to get along just fine, that's ridiculous. And
there's a reason why they're like that. The new man theory, which was what Russia tried and exploded for a really long time, failed so utterly. And I'm not saying what you're talking about won't fail, but the new man theory, trying to create the socialist new superior man through education and through indoctrination and such, it was such an utter dismal failure that people just naturally assume, I guess, from a societal point of view, from a large structural point of view, that it simply can't be done. And I can understand why a lot of people would feel that way.
Well, then, but the funny thing is, because you're making a valid point. There's another reason why we say we're not communists and we're not socialists for that same reason, is that it's not about indoctrinating people into a specific view and then hoping that they'll just hold to that view because you've either scared them with the KGB, or and did any number of other things, or even just tried to love bomb them with patriotism or nationalism or whatever. The Venus Project approach is that rational, critical, and analytical thinking is what everybody gets quote-unquote indoctrinated with, is essentially anti-indoctrination. Anti-think this way because everybody else does. Analyze everything scientifically and rationally, and then encourage your children to do the exact same thing, and then the best systems evolve out of that. That the kind of people that you're talking about, it can't just be, well, I played the Russian national anthem, and then you suddenly feel this rush of adrenaline because you're part of this huge group, and with this, beautiful history and all the other crap that goes into patriotism. It needs to be more along the lines of, isn't it better for everybody here if we analyze the way this particular resource needs to be distributed and then everybody get involved in that? Do you have a better idea? Well, cool. Let's test this hypothesis and see if your idea is correct. That's how you go about, holding such a society together. People who critically think, at least within the Venus Project anyway, people who critically think about how they think a society should function tend to come to those kinds of rationalizations on their own. That's generally like, for example, when I started hanging out with Jacques Fresco, I didn't go through some big indoctrination period. He didn't even really have to say much to me. It was just a matter of, essentially stick to what you can prove, be open-minded to that what you could prove could later be disproven, and then move on to that. One of the problems with things like nationalism and other ways that people try to control groups is that it's just like religion. It requires that the person, essentially hold on to that view solely because of whatever sentimental, or emotional attachment they have to that view. Whereas we kind of seek to say, no, it's not a good way to, in any way, embrace a certain way of life. You need to realize that it's the best solution that you have. And if you come up with something better, then do that.